I was standing in my backyard with a folded citation notice shaking in my hand when the HOA president leaned over my fence and said in the calmest voice imaginable, "You have 10 days to restore this land to HOA standards or we will fine you daily." What she didn't know, what none of them knew at that moment, was that the patch of land she was threatening me over wasn't really theirs to control at all. It was protected land. Federally protected. And the second she said those words, everything changed. I live in a quiet development outside a small town called Red Willow Ridge, tucked into rolling woods and creeks that most people barely notice. When my wife and I bought our home, we were drawn to the backyard first. It backed up to a stretch of trees and tall grass that felt wild and untouched, like nature had decided to spare one corner of the neighborhood. Our realtor had told us it was conservation adjacent, which sounded fancy but mostly meant we were promised privacy and quiet. No neighbors behind us, no fences required. Just land. For the first year, nothing happened. We planted native flowers, put in a small stone path so we could walk without trampling the grass, and set up a bench where I liked to drink coffee in the mornings. No sheds. No fire pits. No loud changes. Just subtle, respectful use of the land. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I came home to a bright orange notice staked into the ground like a warning flag. Unauthorized landscaping, it said. Failure to comply will result in fines. I laughed at first. I genuinely thought it was a mistake. I called the HOA office, left a voicemail, and expected it to be cleared up by Monday. Instead, on Monday evening, I got an email with pictures attached, zoomed-in photos of my backyard. Arrows, circles. Notes complaining about unapproved vegetation, non-compliant pathways, and the most ridiculous line of all, this area must be cleared to maintain uniform community appearance. That was the moment I felt my stomach drop. I emailed back, calmly, explaining that the plants were native, the path was non-invasive, and the land behind my fence line was designated conservation space when we purchased the home. I even attached the disclosure from our closing paperwork. The response came less than an hour later. The HOA does not recognize individual interpretations of land use. All visible property is subject to HOA standards. That sentence lit something in me. Not anger yet, disbelief. How could they just decide that? I requested a meeting. The meeting happened 3 days later in the HOA clubhouse, a beige room with folding chairs and framed photos of past board members lining the wall like a hall of judgment. The president, a woman named Linda Carver, sat at the head of the table with a tight smile. She spoke slowly, carefully, like someone explaining rules to a child. She told me the board had voted. They wanted the grass cut, the plants removed, and the path dismantled. She said it was about property values and consistency. When I mentioned the conservation status again, she waved her hand dismissively and said, "That's between you and the county. We manage appearances." I asked her directly, "So you're asking me to destroy protected land?" She didn't blink. "We're asking you to comply." I left that meeting feeling small, confused, and uneasy. That night, my wife asked me what we were going to do if the fine started. Because they would. The letter said $100 per day after 10 days. That adds up fast. I barely slept. On day 6, the second notice arrived. More photos. A firmer tone. And then, taped to my front door that evening, a warning that if I did not remedy the violation, the HOA would take corrective action at owner expense. That was the moment fear turned into resolve. I pulled out every document from our home purchase and read them line by line. Buried in the disclosures was a phrase I hadn't paid enough attention to before: portions of rear lots abut land under federal conservation easement. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but I was about to. The next morning, instead of calling the HOA, I called the county environmental office. By the time Linda Carver leaned over my fence that afternoon and threatened daily fines, I was already learning that what she was demanding could carry serious legal consequences. Not for me, for her. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The woman at the county environmental office went quiet when I finished explaining the situation. Not the kind of quiet where someone is confused, the kind where they already know where this is going and they do not like it. She asked for my address, then told me to hold. I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window at the backyard, watching the tall grass move in the breeze, suddenly terrified that someone from the HOA might show up with a mower before I figured this out. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed completely. "Sir," she said, "a portion of your rear property is adjacent to land under a federal conservation easement. That land cannot be altered without approval from our office and the federal agency overseeing it." I asked the question that had been clawing at my chest. "So if I cut it down?" There was a pause. Then, very clearly, she said, "You would be in violation of federal law." I felt my hands start to shake, not because I had done anything wrong, but because the HOA was actively ordering me to do something illegal. She explained that decades earlier, a developer had donated that stretch of land into a conservation program to preserve wildlife corridors. The homes were built nearby, but the easement remained. Homeowners could enjoy it visually and passively, but no clearing, grading, or destruction was allowed. The land wasn't owned by me. It wasn't owned by the HOA. It was protected. I asked her what I should do. Her answer was simple. "Do not touch it, and if someone else does, call us immediately." That night, I emailed the HOA again. This time, I attached the county email, quoted the conservation easement language directly, and politely but firmly stated that I would not be altering the land. I asked them to confirm in writing that they would stop pursuing enforcement on protected property. The reply came the next morning. "We have reviewed your message. The HOA maintains its position." That was it. No acknowledgement of the easement. No questions, just arrogance. 2 days later, the fines began. $100 per day. Written out in bold in the notice taped to my door. It felt surreal. Like living inside a bad dream where logic didn't matter. I called Linda Carver directly. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail explaining again that the land was protected and that their actions could have serious consequences. She never called back. Instead, I got a letter from the HOA's attorney. It was cold, clinical, full of legal language designed to intimidate. It stated that the HOA intended to remedy the violation by hiring landscapers to clear the area and bill me for the cost if I did not comply voluntarily. My chest tightened reading that line. They were going to destroy the land themselves. That was when fear fully turned into anger. I drove home early from work that day and parked my car facing the backyard watching. I felt ridiculous, like a guard dog protecting grass. But this wasn't just grass anymore. This was principle. This was my home. And this was them trying to bully me into breaking the law so they could feel powerful. That evening, my neighbor Mark knocked on my door. He lived 2 houses down and had always been friendly, the kind of guy who waved but never got involved in drama. He held one of the HOA notices in his hand. "They came by earlier," he said quietly. "Asked me if I'd seen you modifying the land. Told me they were planning to send a crew." My stomach dropped. "When?" "Soon," he said. I didn't like how they were talking. That night, I called the county back and explained everything. The woman I spoke to transferred me to a supervisor. He listened carefully, then asked me to forward every HOA notice, every email, every threat. By the next morning, I had an official letter from the county stating that any unauthorized alteration of the conservation land would result in fines, penalties, and potential legal action against the responsible party. Not the homeowner, the party ordering or performing the work. I printed 5 copies. One went into an email to the HOA board. One went certified mail to their attorney. One I taped to my back window facing the yard. The fourth stayed on my desk. The fifth I kept just in case. For 3 days, nothing happened. No landscapers, no emails, no notices. I started to think maybe, just maybe, they had backed off. Then, on the fourth morning, I woke up to the sound of engines. I looked out the back window and felt my heart slam into my ribs. 2 trucks, a trailer, men unloading equipment. I ran outside barefoot, waving my arms, yelling for them to stop. The crew leader looked confused, annoyed. He said they were hired by the HOA. Work order said to clear the area. I handed him the county letter. He read it once, then twice, then folded it carefully and said, "I'm not touching this." One of the trucks shut off, then the other. As they packed up, Linda Carver appeared at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. "This isn't over," she said. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No, it really is." She stormed off without another word. That afternoon, the county environmental office called me again. They had received reports that an HOA attempted to authorize work on protected land. An investigation was being opened. By the end of the week, the fines against me were quietly paused. By the end of the next week, the HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting. And for the first time since this started, I realized something important. They weren't in control anymore. They were scared. The emergency HOA meeting notice showed up in everyone's mailbox on a Friday afternoon, printed on bright yellow paper like a warning sign. It announced a special session scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, mandatory attendance encouraged. That alone told me everything I needed to know. HOAs do not panic quietly. When they feel threatened, they gather witnesses. By then, the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to feel. People who had barely spoken to me before suddenly started slowing down when they walked past my house. A few waved. A few looked away. One older woman across the street actually crossed to the other sidewalk. Rumors were moving faster than facts, and the HOA board was doing nothing to stop them. On Sunday afternoon, I found a handwritten note tucked into my mailbox. No stamp, no name. Just a few words written carefully, like the person didn't want their handwriting recognized. "Thank you for standing up to them. They tried this with us too." That note sat in my pocket all day like a quiet promise. I wasn't alone. I had just been the one unlucky enough to be first. Monday morning, I received another email from the HOA attorney. This one was different. The tone had softened just enough to be noticeable. It claimed there had been a misunderstanding regarding the land and requested additional documentation from me to clarify boundaries. I almost laughed. They had my documentation. They had ignored it. Now that the county was involved, they wanted to pretend this was a simple mix-up. I replied with one sentence and attached the same documents again. All relevant documentation has already been provided. That night, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table going over our options. She was calm on the surface, but I could see the stress in the way she folded and unfolded the same piece of paper over and over. We talked about worst-case scenarios, about legal fees, about retaliation. HOAs are notorious for finding new rules to enforce when they lose one battle. What worried me most wasn't the fines anymore. It was the possibility that they would try to make our lives miserable in 100 small ways. Parking complaints, noise violations, nitpicking everything we did. But something else had changed too. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Tuesday night came and the clubhouse parking lot was full. That never happened. I recognized faces I'd never seen at meetings before. People who usually stayed quiet were suddenly curious. When I walked in, the room went noticeably silent for a moment before conversation slowly resumed. Linda Carver sat at the head of the table again, but the confidence she'd worn like armor before was gone. Her smile looked strained. Her hands kept adjusting the stack of papers in front of her. The meeting started with routine nonsense, like they always do. Approval of minutes. Budget updates. Linda cleared her throat more times than necessary. Then she announced they would be discussing recent concerns regarding land management and compliance. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. One of the board members, a man named Howard, who had always struck me as a follower rather than a leader, started talking about visual consistency and community expectations. He spoke in circles, never quite addressing the issue directly. I waited. So did everyone else. Finally, I raised my hand. Linda hesitated before calling on me. I stood up and spoke calmly. I explained, clearly and simply, that the land behind my home was under a federal conservation easement, that the county had confirmed it in writing, that the HOA had attempted to fine me and authorize work that would have violated federal law. I held up the county letter. "This isn't a disagreement," I said. "This is a legal boundary." The room was silent. A few heads turned toward Linda. She straightened in her chair and said, "The HOA was acting in good faith." That was the moment the meeting cracked. A woman in the second row stood up. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She said the HOA had tried to force her to remove a line of trees years earlier, claiming they were too wild. Another man spoke up and said he'd been fined for leaving fallen leaves too long near the same conservation area. Someone else mentioned being told not to place bird feeders because they attracted wildlife. Wildlife. On protected land. Linda tried to regain control. She banged the gavel and reminded everyone to speak one at a time, but it was too late. The dam had broken. This wasn't just about my backyard anymore. This was about years of overreach, intimidation, and people quietly complying because they didn't think they had a choice. I watched Linda's face as she realized what she had unleashed. She wasn't dealing with one stubborn homeowner anymore. She was facing a room full of neighbors who suddenly understood that the HOA's authority had limits. Then someone asked the question she couldn't dodge. Did the board know this land was protected? Linda hesitated. Just for a second, but that second mattered. She said, "We were not formally notified. That was a lie. I had the emails, the certified letter receipts, the attorney correspondence." And judging by the way Howard avoided eye contact, so did at least one other board member. I didn't interrupt. I didn't accuse her outright. I just said, "The county has opened an investigation into the attempted authorization of work on protected land. They asked me to provide documentation." That sentence landed like thunder. The room erupted. People started whispering. Someone asked if the HOA could be fined. Another asked if dues would be affected. That's when fear spreads fastest, when people realize someone else's mistake might cost them money. Linda adjourned the meeting early. As people filed out, neighbors stopped me. Some thanked me quietly. Others asked questions. A few looked genuinely scared. One man pulled me aside and said, "If they get fined, do we pay?" I told him the truth. I didn't know. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was worried about losing, but because I realized how big this had become. The HOA had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The county investigation wasn't just about one incident, it was about a pattern. 3 days later, the county inspector came to my property. He walked the boundary, took photos, asked questions. He confirmed that the land was clearly marked in county records and that any HOA board member should have known. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. "This isn't the first time we've had issues with this association." That explained everything. The following week, the HOA attorney sent another letter. This one formally withdrew all fines against me. It stated that the HOA would cease enforcement regarding the rear land pending further review. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But it didn't matter anymore, because I had just received an email from the county stating that the investigation had expanded to include potential systemic violations, and that was when I understood the truth. The HOA didn't just overstep with me, They had been getting away with it for years. And now, finally, someone had said no. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It crept through the neighborhood slowly, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. At first, everything looked normal on the surface. The HOA still sent out its weekly emails. The landscaping crew still showed up on schedule. Linda Carver still walked the neighborhood every morning with her clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of authority. But underneath that routine, something had shifted. People were watching now. The first real sign came when the county sent a second inspector. This one didn't just look at my backyard. He walked the entire perimeter of the development, stopping at drainage areas, wooded buffers, and the narrow strips of land behind several homes that backed up to the conservation zone. He spoke to homeowners directly, asking what they had been told by the HOA over the years. I watched from my porch as he knocked on doors, clipboard in hand, and saw expressions change as people realized what those questions meant. That afternoon, my neighbor Mark came over again. He looked uneasy, glancing around before speaking. They asked me if the HOA ever ordered me to clear brush near the tree line, he said. I told them yes. Twice. That word hung between us. Twice. By the end of the week, at least 6 homeowners had been contacted. Some of them had complied with HOA demands years earlier, not knowing the land was protected. One older couple down the street admitted they had paid out of pocket to have trees removed because they were threatened with daily fines. Trees that should never have been touched. That's when the anger started replacing the fear. The HOA sent out a carefully worded email claiming the county was conducting a routine review and assuring everyone there was no cause for concern. But the tone felt forced, like a parent insisting everything was fine while the house was clearly on fire. Then the resignations began. First, Howard stepped down for personal reasons. His announcement was brief, posted quietly on the community bulletin board. No farewell message, no explanation. Just gone. A week later, the treasurer followed. Then the secretary. Each resignation chipped away at the image of unity Linda had worked so hard to project. She was alone at the top now. One evening, I found another note in my mailbox. This one wasn't anonymous. It was signed by a woman named Janet, who lived near the back entrance of the neighborhood. She wrote that the HOA had once threatened her with legal action if she didn't remove a small footbridge her late husband had built over a creek. She had complied. The creek was part of the same conservation corridor. She ended the note with a sentence I couldn't stop thinking about. I wish I had known then what you know now. That night, my wife asked me if I was okay, not physically, emotionally. I realized I had been carrying the weight of everyone's anger without meaning to. I hadn't asked to be a symbol. I had just wanted to protect my home. But now, people were looking to me as proof that the HOA could be challenged. I told her the truth. I don't know how this ends, I said, but I know it doesn't go back to the way it was. The next HOA meeting was scheduled 2 weeks later. Attendance was higher than I had ever seen. Linda looked exhausted. The confidence was gone, replaced by tight jaw muscles and quick, defensive responses. She opened the meeting by announcing new temporary guidelines, suspending enforcement near conservation areas until the county completed its review. Someone laughed out loud. She tried to regain control, but the room was different now. Questions came fast. Why weren't homeowners informed earlier? Why were fines issued without proper verification? Why did the HOA attorney authorize landscaping orders that violated county rules? Linda dodged, deflected, claimed misunderstandings. But then one homeowner stood up with printed emails from years ago, where Linda herself had dismissed concerns about protected land as irrelevant technicalities. That was the turning point. You could feel it. The exact moment the room stopped seeing her as an authority figure and started seeing her as a liability. The county report arrived 3 days later. It wasn't made public immediately, but word spread fast. The HOA had been cited for multiple violations related to unauthorized directives involving protected land. The fines weren't astronomical, but they were significant enough to sting. More importantly, the report stated that the HOA board had failed in its duty to properly educate itself on land use restrictions. That phrase showed up again and again. Failed in its duty. The HOA's attorney resigned the following week. Then Linda stopped walking the neighborhood. When she finally sent out a statement, it was no longer written in the confident, commanding tone everyone recognized. It sounded careful, legal, afraid. She insisted the board had acted in the best interest of the community and blamed confusion inherited from previous leadership. But no one was buying it anymore. At the next meeting, a motion was raised to remove her as president. The vote wasn't even close. Linda stood up slowly, gathered her papers, and left without saying a word. No speech. No apology. Just the soft click of the clubhouse door closing behind her. I didn't feel triumphant watching her go. I felt relieved. Because this had never been about revenge. It had been about stopping something that should never have been allowed to continue. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent restructuring. New board members were elected, people who actually listened. A review committee was formed to audit past enforcement actions. Homeowners who had been fined or forced to pay for removals were offered reimbursement where possible. One afternoon, I got a call from the county. They thanked me. Not formally, not with a certificate or public recognition. Just a quiet acknowledgement that standing my ground had prevented further damage. The conservation land would remain untouched, protected, as it should have been all along. That evening, I sat on the bench in my backyard again, listening to the wind move through the tall grass, the same grass the HOA had tried to erase. It was still there, and so was I. The strange thing about winning a fight like this is that it doesn't feel like winning at first. There's no parade, no applause. Just a long, quiet exhale after months of tension you didn't realize had wrapped itself around your chest. That's what the weeks after Linda's removal felt like. Calm, but fragile. Like the neighborhood itself was learning how to breathe again. The new HOA board moved slowly at first, almost cautiously, like they were afraid of making any decision at all. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. The audit committee began reviewing past enforcement actions, and what they found was worse than most people expected. Over a span of more than 10 years, the HOA had issued dozens of warnings, fines, and corrective actions related to areas that bordered or directly overlapped with protected conservation land. Some homeowners had complied out of fear. Others had paid fines they never should have owed. A few had even sold their homes, convinced the HOA pressure would never stop. Seeing that laid out in black and white was sobering. The board sent out a neighborhood-wide letter acknowledging the findings. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They admitted mistakes. They admitted a lack of proper legal guidance. And most importantly, they admitted that the HOA had overstepped its authority. That alone felt like something I never thought I'd hear. The county finalized its investigation shortly after. The HOA was fined and formally ordered to undergo mandatory compliance training related to land use and environmental protections. They were also required to notify all homeowners in writing about the conservation easement and what it meant, something that should have been done from the beginning. No one went to jail. No one was dragged out in handcuffs, and that was fine. This wasn't about punishment for the sake of punishment. It was about stopping harm and preventing it from happening again. One afternoon, I got a knock on my door. It was Janet, the woman who had written me the letter about her late husband's footbridge. She held a small envelope in her hands and looked nervous, like she wasn't sure she should be there. She told me the HOA had approved reimbursement for the bridge she was forced to remove years earlier. It wasn't the full amount, but it was something. She smiled when she said it, then surprised me by tearing up. He would have liked that someone finally stood up, she said. That moment stayed with me longer than any meeting or letter ever did. Over time, the neighborhood started to feel different. Not quieter, freer. People stopped whispering when HOA issues came up. Conversations happened out in the open. New rules were discussed instead of dictated. And for the first time since we moved in, it felt like the HOA existed to serve the community instead of control it. As for Linda Carver, I heard she moved a few towns over. I don't know where exactly, and I don't care. I never saw her again after that night she walked out of the clubhouse. Sometimes, people like her don't learn because they were punished. They learn because their power disappears. And sometimes, they don't learn at all. I still sit on the bench in my backyard most mornings. The tall grass still sways. Birds still nest where they always have. The stone path is worn just enough now to show that it belongs, not because someone approved it, but because it exists in harmony with the land around it. Every once in a while, a neighbor will stop by and comment on how peaceful it looks back there. A few have even asked how they can protect their own property better. I always tell them the same thing. Read everything. Ask questions. And never assume that just because someone sounds confident, they're right. If there's one lesson this whole experience taught me, it's this. Authority without accountability will always push too far. But it only works as long as people stay quiet. The moment someone says no, calmly, clearly, and with the truth on their side, everything changes. I never wanted to be that guy. The troublemaker. The one who challenged the HOA. I just wanted to protect my home and follow the law. What I didn't expect was that doing that would protect other people too. And honestly, that makes every stressful night, every angry letter, and every moment of doubt worth it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?